Washington Journal continues.
Mark Krikorian is back at our desk, the executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, joining us for a discussion about E-Verify in the wake of those ICE enforcement efforts that netted hundreds of undocumented workers in Mississippi. Mark Krikorian, first remind viewers what E-Verify is and who has to use it.
It's a free online system that isn't mandatory yet. It's voluntary, but about half of new hires are screened through it. And so what it is, it's free for employers. When you take the information for your new hire that you have to collect for Social Security and IRS, you have to have their, their information for your payroll. This enables you to check whether the person you hired is actually telling you the truth about who they are. So you enter their name, Social Security number, and date of birth. And what it does is match, see, is the number real? Is the person claiming to be an 8-year-old that has that number? And that kind of thing. In other words, the point is to screen out illegal workers and people with fake IDs. It can be fooled, but it's a lot harder to fool than the Mickey Mouse paper-based system that is mandatory and about half of other employers use.
Who runs the system? Where is it housed?
It's Homeland Security runs it, but it pings information against the Social Security Administration as well, because it's checking your Social Security number and the name and date of birth, which SSA has.
When was it set up and how accurate is it?
It's been, it was mandated as a pilot program in the 1996 immigration law. It was in the George W. Bush administration that it got its current branding as E-Verify. And it's been growing consistently. It has about 750,000 employers using it, but about half of all new hires are screened through it. It's extremely effective. In fact, most of the people who are bounced back as what they call a tentative non-confirmation, like a yellow flag, as it were, are actually U.S. citizens, women who got married but didn't tell Social Security what their married name was yet. And so they'd go to Social Security and clean it up. In fact, I know an organization that's had 2 instances like that. We've used it for years. We haven't had any problems like that. But the point is, in some sense, it's actually a public service, because you want to know that Social Security has your information wrong when you're 25, not when you're 65.
You said 750,000 employers. Some of the latest numbers coming from Senator Mitt Romney's office in a press release. He was talking about legislation on this issue. He pegged it at 864,000
okay. Yeah,
employers.
I was looking at old numbers.
In May 2019. That's approximately 14% of U.S. employers. Who are that 14%?
Mainly bigger employers, because that's why it's 14% of employers, but about 50% or more of all new hires. So big companies, in fact, McDonald's now uses E-Verify, and it used to be the biggest employer of illegal immigrants in the country, just because it's such a huge employer anyway. So a lot of large employers use it. In fact, one of the ways ordinary people can check is that a lot of employers that use it will have a sticker on their door or some kind of logo somewhere. We have it on our website because we also use it, have used it for years. You got to get an okay from E-Verify to do that, obviously. And so that's one of the ways you can check. And in fact, in a lot of cases, illegal immigrants themselves will keep an eye out for that. And if they see that, they'll just go and apply somewhere else.
Talking about E-Verify. If you have questions or comments, now's a good time to call in. Mark Krikorian can answer your questions this morning. 202-748-8000 if you're a Democrat, 202-748-8001 if you're a Republican, 202-748-8002 for independents and business owners. A special line for you this morning if you have questions about it, 202-748-8003. Do we know, in the wake of those ICE enforcement efforts in Mississippi, if those employers used E-Verify?
At least a couple of those firms did claim to use E-Verify. And in fact, in Mississippi, it's mandatory to use E-Verify, because even though at the federal level it's still voluntary, the Supreme Court has ruled that states and localities can make their own E-Verify requirements as a condition of having a business license. Because since the business license is a local or state authority, they're allowed to have that string attached to it. The thing is, they weren't enforcing or even auditing very well. So not only did there were 7 plants rated, not all of them even used it. The ones who used it, it's not clear whether they were using it properly. And what I mean by that is ICE collected a lot of evidence on the employers themselves, on management, and they're building criminal cases against them. The kind of thing that often happens is that a company will use E-Verify, and the management will say, we sign up and we use E-Verify. And then the actual human resources people who do the work and hire the illegal immigrants say, here, I'll enter this number for you as your social security number, and here's your name now. You're now John Jones, and this is your date of birth. In other words, they're partners, they're co-conspirators in the illegal act of hiring. And that's the kind of thing that requires enforcement.
What's the penalty for that? Is that a criminal offense?
It can be. It's either civil or criminal. Usually what they do is just levy civil fines.
Against the company?
Against the company. And what happens often is their lawyers then badger ICE as long as possible and get the fine down to some small level. So the fines need to be higher, but there are potential criminal charges. The problem is the way the law is written, it's hard to make those criminal charges stick. And because you have to be able to prove that they knowingly hired the illegal immigrant. In other words, they knew that person was an illegal alien, and that becomes a harder thing to do.
You studied these issues a lot. What do you expect is going to happen to these 7 companies in Mississippi?
From what ICE has been saying and the U.S. attorney down there has been saying, it looks like there's going to be some criminal charges. I mean, they've made that pretty clear. And the division of ICE that does this sort of thing, because there's 2 divisions of it, it's no reason to get into the bureaucratic minutia, but it's called Homeland Security Investigations. Those are mostly former customs people. They don't really care about immigration enforcement. They do a lot of other stuff like going after people who make fake Gucci handbags and this sort of thing. But if they're going to do immigration, they try to do it as something that's actually going to get indictments. In other words, and they've spent a lot of time with internal informants in these factories. So I expect in the next few weeks, couple months, I mean, it takes a while to build a case like this, you're going to hear about indictments against some of these companies.
Why isn't E-Verify mandatory for every company?
Because the California Farm Bureau doesn't want it to be. I mean, that's really what it boils down to.
Explain.
The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is probably the most important lobbying group in the United States, or in Washington anyway, was resistant to E-Verify. They fought it. They did not want it to be mandatory. But once the Supreme Court ruled that local and state governments could have their own E-Verify mandates, U.S. Chamber of Commerce said, okay, we're for national mandatory E-Verify as long as we have one rule that applies across the whole country.
As opposed to 50
As
state
opposed
rules.
to 50 or even many more, because look, counties and cities could do it. So they actually are now on the same side as the pro-control immigration groups on this issue. And even the American Farm Bureau, which is the national farm lobby, agreed in the previous Congress to back an E-Verify mandate in exchange for increased farm worker legislation. The California Farm Bureau specifically has said under no circumstances. And the now minority leader of the House of Representatives is a California Republican in a rural district. And so that matters. And so until that obstacle can be overcome, we're not going to be able to see whether the Democrats who say they're for E-Verify will actually back it. Because generally their position on the left has been, yeah, we're for E-Verify, but only once every illegal immigrant has been legalized so that there's no more illegal aliens.
Let's chat with a few callers. There's plenty for you. Ann's up first. Tampa Bay, Florida, Republican. Good morning.
Hi, nice to speak to you both. I wanted to say, first off, I've been following this issue. Love C-SPAN. More than 5 years ago, I guess the Gang of 8 hearing took place in the Senate, and I did watch the whole thing with C-SPAN. It was just incredibly good. I remember when they discussed the E-Verify program, and I want to also say to your guest, he knows exactly what he's talking about. Dianne Feinstein did not want to have it, and she wanted some exemptions for her state. But Mr. Schumer, if I recall correctly, wanted a big exemption from the E-Verification going through because he wanted to protect his airline workers. If you look at that film, he says, well, I want exemption for my airline employees. They mean a lot to me. Now, I would like to say that this is something that maybe the government cannot handle, and if there's anybody out there that's doing an e-verification software program and want to sell it to states, maybe states should look into that. And I don't care if it's a national program, because there are pockets of areas in the United States where people are working here for government entities, like in Florida, on different programs, and it's just going to be a quagmire.
Mark Krikorian.
Well, I don't remember that specific instance of the of Schumer wanting that carve out, but that's the kind of thing you hear all the time, where a politician says, you know, I'm all for this program, except that this particular constituent donor group of mine needs to get a special deal. And that's why E-Verify just needs to apply to all new hires, period. Now, the legislation that has come up a number of times, almost passed in the previous Congress, it was bundled with a larger bill, would phase it in. So it would be, you know, the first year big employers would have to use it, and then, you know, the next year smaller ones, that kind of thing, because the biggest employers are the ones who can handle it most easily. They have big human resources departments and all that. And so phasing it in makes sense, but having these carve-outs where this industry doesn't have to use it or what have you, that's not the way to get things done.
Marcel, Hyattsville, Maryland, Democrat. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I got a concern with regards to e-verification and tax ID. Some people they are legal, but they have a tax ID, and how do you reconcile those two?
It's a good question.
Can you explain what's going on there?
Right. It's called, the number he's talking about looks like a Social Security number, but it's called an individual tax ID number. ITIN is the shorthand. And it was designed for people who are not Americans, not residents of the United States, but have to pay taxes. Basically, foreigners who have bank accounts here, that kind of thing. What happened is the IRS started issuing them to illegal immigrants. And so there are a lot of instances where an illegal immigrant will give the fake or stolen Social Security number to his employer, but they will then file a tax return with the IRS using the real number that the IRS gave them. And so the IRS actually knows who most illegal immigrants are because they have their tax returns, which have two different numbers. Instead of somebody who has legitimate information, the numbers are the same. If you enter a tax ID number into E-Verify, it's going to red flag you because that's not a Social Security number, and the Social Security Administration knows it. And so people working with using a tax ID number to file taxes are illegal immigrants by definition, almost in every case, because the number is for people who aren't working, don't live here, but have to pay taxes anyway. In other words, they don't have a Social Security number if you don't live here, but if you have a bank account, you have to pay taxes on the interest. And so that's what the number is for. If someone's working and uses that number, they're illegal immigrants by definition.
Has there ever been an effort to compare those two forms that you were just talking about, if it's that easy?
Sure there is. And the IRS knows who they are, and the IRS couldn't care less because they've said our mission is to collect taxes and to send out refunds and nothing else. We don't care about immigration status. That's the kind of thing that, and the IRS says, look, this is a statutory mandate. We're not even allowed to do anything else. This is something Congress needs to address.
Stephen has a question from Twitter. What are the disadvantages of E-Verify?
There's not really very many, honestly. It's free. It's, you know, probably the most accurate federal government program there is. It does take a few minutes to do it, but it's part of the hiring process. You're taking time to do that anyway. The disadvantage, to the extent there is one, is that it's not perfect. In other words, you can still sneak through E-Verify, potentially even legitimately. The problem is you have to buy an expensive, custom-made fake identity because the date of birth has to be similar to yours. In other words, you can get a name and Social Security number anywhere. Date of birth has to match yours, and increasingly, the photo has to look like you, because if you present a green card, a work permit, a passport, your picture comes up. And in about, I think, 8 or 10 states now, and the number's increasing, if you present a driver's license, the legitimate one in the database of that state also pops up. And so it can be fooled, but it's a lot harder to fool legitimately. I mean, if the hiring person is in cahoots with the illegal worker, it can be fooled, but that's a crime. legitimately it's hard to fool, but it can be done.
How long has your group been calling for mandatory E-Verify usage?
As long as there's been E-Verify. In fact, even before they called it E-Verify, we've always been for this. It's not a magic bullet. I mean, if Congress passed this today, it phased in over 3 years or 4 years. It's not like illegal immigration bingo would disappear, because the legislation mainly deals with, in other words, right now it's only for new hires. So the question is, do you E-Verify the people already working for you? In some cases, federal contractors have to do that. But my point is, we passed it today. Illegal immigration doesn't go away, but it's the single most important step we need to take toward controlling illegal immigration.
For folks that don't know, what is the Center for Immigration Studies?
We're a small think tank. Here in DC, there's hundreds of think tanks. There's big ones I call department store think tanks, where you have to, you push 4 to go for healthcare or on the elevator. We're a little think tank, a little mammal running between the legs of the dinosaurs. We've been around since 1985, and all we do is look at the different kinds of impacts immigration in general, legal and illegal, has on the United States, whether it's economic, security, population, whatever it is. And we work to make a case for a pro-immigrant policy of lower immigration. In other words, fewer immigrants in the future, but a warmer welcome for those we do take in.
CIS.org is the website if you want to talk to Mark Krikorian. Phone lines are open to do so. Lines for Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and that special line for business owners, 202-748-8003. Kurt's a Republican out of Las Vegas. Good morning.
Good morning. I read an article a while back that Trump proposed a 10% cut in E-Verify, and I was wondering, with the state of things of 100,000 people trying to get in every day at the southern border, do you think Trump will change his mind and propose a 100% increase to E-Verify?
And Kurt, are you talking funding?
Yes, funding from the federal government. Now, I read this article a while back. It's about 3 months ago. It was actually broadcasted on Tucker Carlson.
I'm actually not familiar with specifically what he's talking about, but E-Verify doesn't actually cost that much, and it does. Even expanding it to every employer in the country wouldn't really cost that much more, because they already have the IT capacity to screen every single new hire.
When we say not much in terms of government funding,
I don't know what
are we talking millions or billions?
Oh, it's millions. I mean, obviously, this is Washington. You don't blow your nose for more than millions. I don't know the actual number, but the point is, it doesn't. We could expand it to all new hires. It still wouldn't really increase the cost very much. The interesting point is that the president has always been kind of skeptical about E-Verify. And I think there's a whole series of stories the Washington Post has been doing that suggests one of the reasons is his businesses use a lot of illegal immigrants. I'm not saying the president knowingly broke the law. It's not, because it's just that if you run a golf club and you don't have E-Verify, you're probably hiring some illegal immigrants. There's really no way around it. And so my sense is that's one of the reasons for his skepticism.
You ever talk to the White House about this issue?
Not specifically on this, no.
What issues have you consulted with them on?
Well, I don't know. I mean, they've called us for information on things like welfare use and that sort of thing. So overall numbers, the way, the different visa programs, that sort of thing.
Tony's next, out of Joplin, Maryland. Independent. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Say, I might have been a little late coming in on the program. I don't know whether you addressed this or not, but I received a letter from the IRS about a couple of months ago indicating that somebody could have used my Social Security number for employment. And it kind of forced me to go to the Social Security office, and I was just, wondering whether or not that somebody could use my Social Security number, like in California and up in Maryland. Although that I'm retired right now, I'm still eligible to work, and I don't know how the system works, whether or not that they could identify somebody that using my number.
This kind of thing happens all the time. This is one of the big problems that illegal immigration causes. In other words, supposedly it's a victimless crime. Your prior guest would have said that nobody's harmed by it. The fact is, millions of Americans are victims of identity theft and identity fraud. And E-Verify actually is helpful It doesn't solve the problem, but there is something called E-Verify Self-Check. You can just Google that, E-Verify Self-Check. You can E-Verify yourself, first of all, just to make sure that they have your information right. But you can also lock your Social Security number down so that you would then unlock it if you were to go get a new job and it would be checked. But if you lock your Social Security number down, this is a free service, any citizen can do it.
Available on the website, which we just showed
on the
viewers?
website, yeah, on E-Verify. It's somewhere on the E-Verify site, so you just Google self-check. And you can lock your Social Security number down. This doesn't mean that in other purposes someone can't steal your ID for non-employment purposes, but that is a way to make sure someone can't use your Social Security number, steal it, in order to get a job illegally. And that causes all kinds of problems for people when their IDs are stolen.
To Houston, Texas. Charlotte, Republican, good morning.
Good morning. I worked for a company, a big construction company, who used E-Verify, and the HR involved that went through this scammed, for lack of a better term. They would hire the illegal. They would tell the illegal that they needed to pay them $200 every week out of their paycheck, or they'd make sure that they got fired. So there are ways around this E-Verify that, I think need to be addressed.
Yeah, there's no question there's ways around it, but what you're describing is criminal activity. In other words, any government requirement has criminal activity. If you don't pay your taxes, you can do that. It's just that you're committing a crime. And in this case, the human resources employees of the company, as well as the illegal immigrants themselves, were engaging not just in a civil violation that you get a parking ticket for, but that's actual criminal activity. The challenge often for law enforcement, and this is the same kind of thing in, say, drug organizations, how do you move up the chain? How do you move up from that human resources person who's engaging in the criminal activity to see if you can get to higher management? And often what you see, the reason it's hard to go after the CEOs of these companies is because they've maintained a kind of plausible deniability where there's a wink and a nudge and there's no proof that they were telling the HR people to do this kind of thing. That's one of the reasons that people, while they're legitimately angry that CEOs don't get hit, it's legally difficult to go after them because they sort of have these layers of protection they build around them.
I don't know how you feel about hypotheticals, but Mark asks on Twitter, if a vote in Congress happened this year to make E-Verify mandatory, what's your prediction of the outcome of that vote? Who would vote for it and who would vote against it? Or would it even be allowed on the floor?
Yeah, I mean, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, would not allow it on the floor. I mean, there's just no chance of that whatsoever. I'm not letting the Republicans off the hook because there's some of them that are pretty bad too, but there's literally no way that the Democrats would allow it. And part of it at this point is simply because the administration wants it. Whatever the president's skepticism is on it, he's overcome that, I think, for political reasons, if nothing else. And so if President Trump wants it, the Democrats don't. I mean, if he said the sky is blue, they'd say, no, it's green. I mean, it's gotten to that level of irrationality. So there's simply no way it's going to come up in the next, before Congress changes in 2021.
We're interviewing you here. You were interviewing Senator Tom Cotton recently at the Center for Immigration Studies. One of the issues you talked about was the hurdles when it comes to mandatory E-Verify. Here's some of what he had to say from that interview.
And I speak to senior business executives in industries that do, in certain parts of the country, rely heavily on immigrant labor, like hospitality. And they frequently tell me, is like, look, we think we need more workers. We understand you don't see it that way, but we use E-Verify. And we want to make sure that every person who works here is legally authorized to be in this country and to work. That's part of the reason we do that is because when we say we need more workers, we want to be able to say, and all of our workers are legal as well. But I think there's still plenty of employers who would rather not do that. Would rather look the other way and benefit from the more control and more loyalty, as you said, in the H-1B context, and lower wages, and also people on the left that just in their kind of devotion to identity politics don't want to do anything that smacks of internal enforcement.
Mark Krikorian, can you talk about the members of Congress who come through your institute and the conversations that you have with them about E-Verify?
Well, I mean, there are real champions of E-Verify. I mean, the two people who are now retired from the House of Representatives were really leaders in this. Congressman Goodlatte, who was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, but even before him, Congressman Lamar Smith from Texas, who retired this previous Congress. He's the one who wrote the mandatory E-Verify bill a number of years ago. He's been a champion of it for years. And so, you know, there are people who really are champions and understand this. Obviously, Senator Cotton and Senator Perdue co-sponsored a broader bill on immigration. And interestingly, Senator Romney also is trying to get something passed that conceivably might get passed. It's a smaller bite. And so he's figuring, look, Democrats aren't going to go for mandatory E-Verify. What about simply making E-Verify permanent? Because the way it is now, every year it needs to be reauthorized in the budget process. And so he has introduced, I think he's actually introduced it, a bill simply to make it permanent. Doesn't make it mandatory, it's just that every year it doesn't have to be reauthorized. That maybe, I mean, I wouldn't hold my breath, but that's at least a realistic goal.
For folks who aren't into how DC works, how unusual is a permanent authorization?
I mean, there's both kinds. There are permanent, there's a lot of things that are permanently authorized. You know, much of the immigration function, the USCIS, that's the part of Homeland Security that does the visas and green cards and what have you. They have a variety of functions that are permanently authorized. And then there are others that have to be authorized every year. And so what that does is it gives opponents a chance to either kill it or use it as leverage to try to get something else, that sort of thing. And so permanently authorizing E-Verify, it doesn't mean you permanently fund it. It just means that you don't have, Congress doesn't have to every year say this is now allowed to continue. That's an important, if modest, step forward.
About 10 or 15 minutes left with Mark Krikorian. Again, do have that line set aside for business owners if you have questions about E-Verify. Edwards in Washington, D.C., a Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. How you doing? C-SPAN, I think we need, this is an immigrant nation, we need to stop frightening undocumented people and stop using terms like illegal immigrant and stop using separating children from their parents and so forth. This is an immigrant nation. All came to the United States, humble people, poor and meek, seeking for a better life. I am Edward H. Dowdy, Jr. My father, Edward H. Dowdy, Sr., came to this country as an immigrant person, and he is a veterinarian. And the thing here is, and this president, number 45, is using this thing as a political thing. He knows that's going to get his base excited, and it's going to frighten people. We should stop doing that. And
Mark Krikorian, let you jump in.
Well, it's an important point, and this is really a basic point, goes even more sort of deeper than E-Verify. Do we want to have limits on immigration or not? Because if the answer is yes, that we're going to have some limits on immigration, because after all, there are hundreds of millions of people. Gallup actually polled and found close to 200 million people who would want to move here tomorrow if they could, and obviously many more would once something like that started. So if you're not for unlimited immigration, then there are always going to be illegal immigrants because you have to have limits, and those limits have to be enforced. So either you're for unlimited immigration, as your previous guest is in favor of, no limits whatsoever on immigration. Anybody can move here. In fact, they have a right to move here. Or if immigration is a privilege that we decide and we limit, then there's always going to be people who are going to want to break those rules. And that means there's always going to be illegal immigrants and the need for immigration enforcement.
Speaking of our previous guest, a topic that obviously you're interested in as well, the public charge rule. Your thoughts on that? We saw the quote from you in the Washington Times, but wanted to give you a chance to talk about it a little bit.
It's long overdue to lay out in some more detail what a public charge is. And this is obviously a technical term, but the basic concept is something people understand. Immigrants shouldn't be allowed to move here if they can't support themselves. This is not just something that the federal government required in the 1800s. That's the federal law requiring that started in the 1800s. This is something that dates to the 1600s. The first immigration law ever passed in America was in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1645, and it said people who can't support themselves shouldn't be allowed to move to the colony. And so what the new public charge rule simply does is overturn a Clinton-era rule that in effect defined welfare use only to cash benefits. In other words, you could be considered self-sufficient as an immigrant so long as you didn't use cash welfare, but got food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, lived in public housing, all of that, as long as it wasn't cash. That's a surreal, almost a meaningless thing. And so this rule simply lays out in more detail, in a modern welfare state, what does it mean to be a so-called public charge? What does it mean to be able to support yourself or to be living off the money of the taxpayer?
San Diego, California is next. Dave, Independent, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, yes, immigration is a privilege, and your guest is very informative. I really appreciate it. As far as how vulnerable is the system to being hacked, I know the guy before asked about illegal Social Security numbers, but how vulnerable is the system to be hacked and able to extract information from legal U.S. citizens? Thank you.
Well, as far as hacking, in other words, from the outside, I don't know anything about its IT security, but in a sense, there's really not much to hack because E-Verify isn't some kind of database that has all of your information on it. That's what the Social Security Administration has. E-Verify is really just kind of the window through which an employer can check whether the Social Security information is correct or not. So E-Verify itself is not some vast database. It's just a tool to look at Social Security and, in some cases, Homeland Security information. That's where the hacking issue has to be focused, if there is one. And I have no idea. I don't know anything about that.
Madison, Mississippi, Carl, Democrat, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. I would like to have a question. Immigrants, I know that in this 1820, some 200 years ago, this coming 2020, many Europeans came over here, but you were using the history of the 13 colonies. And from reading that story, and I researched it, in 1820, a lot of the countries in Europe was not able to take care of a lot of people there, so the immigration issue is a tight issue. I was not aware of good information, what you were sharing with the people, but a lot of stuff we just don't know about because it was just put under the desk and they won't bring it up for vote because everybody here is an immigrant, put it that way. African American, Native, everybody. So we're not really talking about the issue. This came been around over 600 years ago.
Carl in Mississippi.
The interesting thing is 1820 is actually the reason. There's nothing special that happened then, but what happened, though, is that's when the federal government starts recording immigration information. So all of when you look at the historical data, 1820 is when it starts. And
why did they start then?
I'm not sure. It was, they just, the port inspectors at New York and elsewhere, they started collecting the information. The interesting thing is, when you look even further back and look sort of through the whole sweep of American history, immigration's gone up and down. We had significant immigration until the French and Indian War. Immigration stopped, really, until around the 1820s, for a long time, and then it started again. 1848 is when immigration really exploded because of the Irish potato famine and the uprisings in Germany. A lot of people came here. Then, from then until about 1924, we had about a lifetime's worth of high immigration. Then we had low immigration. Now we have high immigration again. My point here is that high levels of immigration like we're experiencing today is not some constant in American history. We've always had some immigration, but it's fluctuated. There's been waves, and we're just in another wave, and the idea of reducing it to a somewhat lower level is not some unprecedented thing in our history.
Just about 5 minutes left with you or so. I wanted to ask you about a New York Times story, a front page story today that mentions the Center for Immigration Studies, looking at the funding that Cordelia Scaife May gave to your group and other groups, the New York Times calling her one of those who bankrolled the founding and operations of the nation's largest restrictionist groups. Who is Cordelia Scaife May?
She passed away a number of years ago. She was a philanthropist. She was a part of the Mellon family. I actually don't, I mean, she was our biggest funder. She's, like I said, passed away a number of years now.
14 years ago.
Something like that, yeah. And she came at the issue from the concern about population growth, because once American birth rates fell, just voluntarily, people just had fewer kids now after the baby boom. Immigration was the thing driving, immigration was what was driving American population growth, and that was her concern from an environmental perspective. Other people come at the immigration issue from, say, security or law enforcement or other perspectives. It's an interesting thing that you need to put in context, and that is that the concerns about high levels of immigration, not just illegal, but legal as well, like I said, come from different angles: population, environment, security, assimilation, workforce. But they're really all just the same thing, different aspects of the same thing, which is that mass immigration in a modern society with a post-industrial economy, a welfare state where people have smaller families, where transportation and communication shrink the world, make immigration a problem in a whole variety of ways. So really, there's a story about a bunch of blind men touching different parts of an elephant, and they think they're holding different things. The guy who holds the tail thinks he has a broom in his hand, that sort of thing. Well, immigration's sort of similar. People who look at it from the population perspective, or security, or workforce, or government benefits, all are holding different parts of the elephant. It's all connected.
For you, what perspective first brought you to this issue?
What brought me first to it was concerns about assimilation. That I grew up speaking Armenian. I didn't speak English when I went to kindergarten. And, I learned it. And my concern is that in in modern conditions, after the 60s and 70s and all of the changes we saw in government, we weren't stressing assimilation of newcomers enough. And I think we're still not doing a good job at that. But as I sort of got more into it, I understood, as I said, that I was holding the tail of the elephant and thinking I had a broom, when in fact there's a whole elephant and it's all really the same problem.
Time for a few more callers for you. Tony, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, independent. Good morning.
Yes, Ed, I thank you for letting me talk or speak. Well, and sir, assimilation is the thing that they've totally forgotten about. Assimilation is the key to it all. They've totally forgot about assimilation. And I think with that, we may have to change our tactics in the long run and change our mindset in the long run, too, because think about, we may have to go into a freeze, stop all immigration for a while, get a hold of it, get control of it. And then we may have to change our tactics with our powers within our country. We'll maybe just tell them that if they come to our country, they have to go to the military for a while and serve the military for 7 years or something like that, and then make sure they can speak English. Assimilation.
There's no question assimilation is one of the key elements of a successful immigration policy. And there's more to it than people often think. English is part of it. I mean, this is our language, and you should learn English. And the thing is, even the advocates, the open borders advocates, say, well, of course people should learn English in order to get a better job. But it's really more than just learning English, getting a job, and driving on the right side of the road. It's actually adopting America and Americans as your people. And, I think we overestimate how much people 100 years ago wanted to do that, and I think we underestimate today how much people we want to do that. The problem, of course, here is twofold. Just to quickly, what's different today? Cheap transportation and communications makes it easier to live in two countries at the same time, and our elites don't really value assimilation the way they used to, and immigrants kind of get that message. And so what we need to do, the problem here is not the immigrants, it's us. We need to make clear we welcome you, but you need to become part of the American people, and we want to help you do that.
Hetty is in Camp Hill, Alabama, a Republican. Good morning.
Good morning. Mark.
Yes.
Mark, let me say something, sir. I had went to an estate sale back about 2 years ago, and I bought a bunch of boxes. Well, in that box was some stuff, and it said startup kit, and it's all in Spanish, but it has a Social Security card in there with a number on it, but it doesn't have a name up on top of it. And it also, now I got a lady that I know that could speak Spanish, and she read out to me what this was. This was handed out to people that come across the border back during the Obama administration. And it also, she read that what you done, you called, they had it's got an 800 number. You call that 800 number, you give that Social Security number, then you fix a name to it. And it is supposed to be a legit Social Security number.
Mark Krikorian, you ever heard of something like that?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure, but I mean, this kind of thing doesn't surprise me. There's all kinds of packages of either fake or stolen IDs that people can buy.
Time for one more call. Helen is in Michigan, a Democrat. Good morning.
Hi, John. How are you?
Doing well. You're on with Mark Krikorian.
And hi, Mark. I'm going to be real quick. This last week, I got a robocall. I screen all my calls, but I got a robocall, and it said it was the Social Security office, and that my Social Security number was being suspended for illegal activity. And it says, press 1 now, and then it repeated itself. Well, I knew it was probably malarkey, but it scared the crap out of me. I'm sorry to tell you, but, Social Security numbers mean a lot to me. That's who you are.
Yeah,
that's who you are.
I can pretty much guarantee that was a scam. Don't press 1. But people's Social Security numbers are frequently stolen. It happens all the time. And there are a variety of private, for pay services that try to protect that. But like I said, something called E-Verify Self-Check lets you not only check whether your information is correct on the Social Security computers, but lets you lock down your Social Security number. It doesn't mean somebody can't steal it for other things, medical stuff or crime or police or what have you. But it does mean they won't be able to use it to get a job, because what often happens is if somebody's using your number to get a job and then maybe not paying taxes, well, the IRS says, you owe us money for your taxes, and it's, you didn't do it. In other words, you're the victim of identity theft. So there are ways to protect yourself from that. That call was almost certainly a con, but it's a real problem in there, and you should proactively try to protect yourself if you're worried about it.
Mark Krikorian is the Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies. It's CIS.org if you want to check out their work, and we appreciate your time.
And I'm on Twitter at Mark S. Krikorian if people like snark and sarcasm.
And we'll see you again down the road.
Thank you.